You ever had your whole life blocked by one shiny car I have? It wasn't just any car, it was a Porsche 911 parked right across my ranch gate. And the driver, none other than Amara Wallace, the iron-fisted president of our HOA. She didn't just enforce rules, she bent them, twisted them, and weaponized them. And when she wanted to remind me who held the power, she parked that Porsche right where it hurt most, in front of my only entrance. Deliveries couldn't get through, friends couldn't visit, even my truck sat stranded like a caged bull. Amara called it community curb space. I called it what it was, pure arrogance on four wheels. She thought I'd roll over. She thought her Porsche was untouchable. What she didn't know was that I had another plan. Because sometimes you don't call a tow truck. Sometimes you bring in a tank. Before I tell you how Amara's pride and joy turned into scrap metal, drop a comment below, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The first time I saw it, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a guest from down the street had pulled in for a quick turnaround. Maybe some delivery driver had gotten lost. But no, there it sat, polished and proud, a Porsche 911, gleaming like a mirror under the Texas Sunday, and parked perfectly across my ranch gate. I remember standing there, coffee mug in hand, staring at that German machine like it was some sort of joke, except the punchline wasn't funny. That car wasn't just blocking my view, it was blocking my life. My gate was the only entrance to the property. Without it, no deliveries came through, no guests could enter, and even my own truck was pinned in like a bull in a corral. And then, just as I was about to knock on my neighbor's door to see who had misplaced their Porsche, the truth strutted up the gravel driveway in heels Amara Wallace. Now let me tell you about Amara. If arrogance ever put on lipstick and pearls, her name was Amara Wallace. She was the queen bee of our HOA, always polished, always smiling for the board meetings, always ready to recite bylaws like scripture. But that smile, it had teeth. Amara didn't lead with kindness, she led with intimidation. And her Porsche, that was her throne on wheels. She looked at me standing there by my blocked gate, gave me the kind of smirk you usually see in courtroom dramas, and said, "Jaden, this is HOA-regulated curb space. Perfectly legal. HOA-regulated curb space." Now, I may not be a lawyer, but I know my land. And that curb space wasn't public at all. It was my private access easement written in black ink on the deed to the property. I knew it. She knew it. But the thing about Amara Wallace was that knowing the rules never stopped her from twisting them into a pretzel. "Move your car," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed the kind of laugh that sounded rehearsed for an audience. "Oh, Jaden, you'll have to take it up with the board. Until then, my Porsche is right where it belongs." And with that, she strutted back into her immaculate stucco house across the street, leaving her prized machine guarding my gate like a watchdog made of steel and arrogance. That day, my Amazon delivery never arrived. A friend who tried to visit had to park 3 blocks away and hop the fence. Even the mailman shook his head and muttered something about rich people problems as he handed me a stack of envelopes at the road. But I kept my cool. One day, I told myself, one day it'll move. Except it didn't. The next morning, there it was again, same spot, same angle, like it had never left. My gate was locked in once more, and this time the smirk on Amara's face as she drove off to a meeting told me it wasn't a coincidence. By the end of that week, it became routine. Sunrise meant coffee, and the sight of Amara's Porsche squatting in front of my gate. Sunset meant she'd either move it or leave it overnight just to remind me who ran this neighborhood. Neighbors started whispering. "Isn't that illegal?" they'd ask. "Why don't you call the cops?" Oh, I tried. Believe me, I tried. But the officers took one look at the HOA paperwork. Amara waved in their faces and shrugged. Civil dispute, they called it, which was cop speak for not our problem. And Amara made sure everyone knew it. At the next HOA meeting, she stood up, adjusted her pearl necklace, and in her most theatrical voice declared, "We all must respect parking rights, even if certain individuals don't like it." Her friends on the board chuckled. Her allies nodded. And me, I sat in the back row, jaw clenched so tight I thought my molars might crack. It wasn't just the inconvenience that burned me, it was the principle. That gate wasn't just a piece of wood and hinges. It was the line between my home and her control. And she had planted her Porsche right across it, like a queen planting her flag on conquered soil. I remember one night after another, long day of seeing that silver car mock me from the gate, I sat on my porch and just stared at it. The moonlight caught the curves of its frame, highlighting every polished inch, and all I could think was, she really believes nothing can touch her. And in that moment, I promised myself something I would find a way to prove her wrong. But at that time, all I could do was wait. Wait and seethe. Wait and watch. Wait and sip my coffee every morning while that Porsche stared back at me, daring me to act. The truth is, Amara Wallace wasn't just blocking my gate. She was testing me. Testing how far she could push, how deep her claws could dig before I finally snapped. She thought my silence meant surrender. She thought her Porsche was untouchable. She thought wrong. If there's one thing I've learned about HOA presidents like Amara Wallace, it's that they never stop at one victory. No, once they sense you're irritated, once they catch even the faintest whiff of resistance, they push harder. And Amara, she didn't just push, she floored the gas pedal. By the second week, her Porsche wasn't just blocking my gate in the mornings. It was there at lunchtime, at dinner time. Some nights she left it parked until dawn, headlights winking at me like the smug grin she wore at every HOA meeting. It was a campaign of slow, deliberate suffocation, and I was the only target. Neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Alvarez, 2 houses down, whispered to me while watering her roses. "She's doing it on purpose, Jaden. Everyone knows." "I know," I said, my jaw tight. "She's trying to break you, Mrs." Alvarez added, glancing nervously toward Amara's house, as if the woman could hear us through stucco walls. And she was right. This wasn't about parking. It was about control. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. I had a lumber delivery scheduled materials for repairing my barn roof. The truck pulled up, the road driver leaning out the window, scanning for my address. And there it was again, Amara's Porsche sprawled across my gate like a lazy cat blocking the doorway. The driver shook his head. "Sorry, sir. I can't unload here. No access." I had to redirect him 2 miles down where he dropped the wood on the roadside. I spent the rest of the day hauling it piece by piece in the bed of my pickup after backing my truck out through a neighbor's yard. By the time the sun set, my arms burned, my back ached, and the Porsche was still sitting there gleaming under the streetlight like a sentinel mocking my misery. That evening, I marched straight to Amara's front door. She answered wearing a silk robe, wineglass in hand, smile sharp enough to cut steel. Enjoying the new view, she asked sweetly, gesturing toward the gate and her Porsche. "Move it," I snapped. "Now." Her eyes sparkled with something between amusement and malice. "Oh, Jaden, you're so dramatic. It's community curb space. You don't own the street. It's not the street. It's my easement. You know that." She took a slow sip of wine, savoring the moment. "Prove it." And just like that, she closed the door in my face. That night, I pulled out the thick manila folder I'd inherited with the ranch deed. Survey maps, county records. Every piece of evidence a sane person would need to understand that yes, the land in front of that gate was mine. Not HOA's, not public. Mine. At the next HOA meeting, I brought copies for everyone. I stood before the board, laid out the maps like a lawyer making a closing argument, and said, "This proves Amara is trespassing on my property." The room went quiet. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One man muttered, "He's right." But Amara, always the actress, stood, smoothed her blazer, and addressed the room with her trademark condescension. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "Mr. Cross is misinterpreting old documents. These easements are subject to community bylaws, and as president, I have every right to designate parking use as I see fit." Her allies on the board nodded like puppets on strings. One even chimed in, "She's correct. The HOA has jurisdiction." I stared at them in disbelief. "Jurisdiction doesn't mean you can trespass on private property," Amara smiled, victory already in her eyes. "If you don't like it, Jaden, take it to civil court. Until then, the board supports my interpretation." The gavel came down, and just like that, my evidence was brushed aside like a gum wrapper. I walked out of that meeting, fuming, neighbors whispering behind me. Some avoided eye contact. Others gave sympathetic nods. But one thing was clear: as long as Amara wore the HOA crown, no paper, no map, no deed was going to matter. That night, while sitting on my porch, I replayed her smirk over and over in my mind. The way she dared me to act. The way she basked in her untouchable Porsche, knowing the rules bent around her like gravity. Her last words echoed in my ears, "Touch my car and you'll answer to the entire HOA." She thought her Porsche was a shield. She thought the HOA was an army. She thought her power was unshakable. And maybe she was right if I kept fighting her in meetings and paperwork, but I wasn't planning to fight her on her turf anymore. I glanced toward the barn where my old military gear, dusty boxed away, still sat on a shelf. My boots, my medals, photos of my unit standing in front of steel beasts that made even the toughest men look small. Amara thought she'd won. She thought the game was over. But in that moment, staring at that Porsche glinting in the moonlight, I knew the game had only just begun. The next morning, I promised myself I'd try once more to do things the right way. Call me stubborn, call me naive, but I wanted to at least say I'd played by the rules before I burned the rulebook. I started simple. A polite note. I slipped it under the wiper of Amara's Porsche while it sat there polished and smug as ever in front of my gate. Please do not block my entrance. This is private property. JC. I even wrote it in neat block letters, no sarcasm, no jabs, nothing but the facts. That evening when I came back from town, I found the note taped to my mailbox with Amara's handwriting scrawled across it. Nice try. HOA rules supersede your opinion. Opinion. She called my deed an opinion. The next day I called the police again. I met Officer Daniels at the gate pointing to the Porsche like it was a crime scene. She's trespassing, I said, holding up my paperwork. He glanced at the car, then at me, then at the papers like they were homework he didn't want to grade. Looks like a civil matter, Mr. Cross. Civil. She's blocking my only access road. Deliveries can't get in. What happens if I need an ambulance? Daniel shrugged, adjusting his belt. Take it up with the HOA. We can't get involved unless there's a disturbance. A disturbance. I nearly laughed. If crushing someone's property rights under a German luxury car didn't count as a disturbance, I didn't know what did. So I took it up with the HOA again. At the next board meeting, I stood at the podium holding up my survey maps like a preacher holding scripture. This, I said, voice steady, is proof that Amara Wallace is trespassing on my land. A murmur ran through the room. For a second, I thought maybe reason would prevail. Then Amara rose, her blazer crisp, her pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She smiled that politician's smile and said, "Neighbors, let's not be misled. Mr. Cross is confusing legal terminology. Yes, there is an easement, but under community guidelines, parking enforcement falls to the HOA, which means my Porsche is in full compliance." Her allies on the board nodded, dutifully parroting phrases like community trust and bylaw interpretation. One even said, "If you can't handle HOA rules, maybe this isn't the neighborhood for you." The gavel came down. My petition denied. Again. As the meeting adjourned, Amara leaned close to me, her perfume sharp, her words sharper. "You really should consider downsizing that truck of yours, Jaden. Or better yet, downsizing your ego." The room chuckled. I clenched my fists so tight I could feel my nails digging into my palms. But still, I tried one more approach. I called my lawyer. He reviewed the documents, scratched his chin, and said, "You've got a solid case, Jaden, but litigation takes time. Months, maybe years. And the HOA has money. They'll drag this out." Meanwhile, I said, "She parks across my gate every day." He sighed. Meanwhile, yes. By the end of that week, I was exhausted. My barn repairs stalled because materials couldn't get through. Friends stopped visiting, too much hassle with the blocked gate. Even deliveries got rerouted to a pickup station in town, adding 2 extra hours to my day. And through it all, Amara Wallace thrived. She'd walk past me in the mornings, power walking in her neon jogging suit, earbuds, and tossing me a cheery wave. "Morning, Jaden. Lovely weather, isn't it? Lovely weather?" While her Porsche sat like a steel barricade in front of my home, I started noticing the way she flaunted it in front of the neighbors, too. At block parties, she'd joke Jaden's so possessive about his little gate. You'd think he was guarding Fort Knox. People laughed politely, but I could see the unease in some of their eyes. They knew she was abusing her power, but fear of the HOA kept them silent. The final straw came one Friday evening. I had invited my sister and her kids over for dinner. I grilled steaks, set the table, even put on music. But when they pulled up, they couldn't get in because the Porsche was parked across the gate again, lights off, engine cold like a sentinel that never slept. My sister called from the road, frustration in her voice. "Jaden, we can't get through. Should we just go home?" I looked at the table I'd set, at the food I'd prepared, at the empty driveway. My blood boiled. I marched across the street and banged on Amara's door. She opened it, glass of Chardonnay and hand smile as smug as ever. "Problem?" she asked sweetly. "You're blocking my family from getting in. Families should learn to park in designated areas. Rules are rules. Move the car." She sipped her wine. No, that was it. The last line crossed. The final ounce of patience drained. I walked back across the road, my sister still waiting at the gate, and I told her to head home. I promised her I'd visit them soon, but inside something snapped, because in that moment I realized the truth. The system was never going to save me. Not the police, not the board, not the courts. Amara Wallace had built a fortress out of bylaws and influence, and she thought she was untouchable. But I had something she didn't expect. I had history, I had connections, and I had imagination. And if Amara wanted a war, then by God, she was about to get one. After that Friday evening, I sat on my porch, long after the steaks had gone cold. The The sound of crickets buzzed in the distance, but all I could hear was Amara's voice echoing in my head. Rules are rules. The image of her Porsche smugly stationed in front of my gate seared into my brain like a brand. I felt cornered. And when you back a man into a corner, he only has two choices: surrender or fight his way out. I'd spent weeks trying the peaceful route notes, police meetings, even lawyers. Nothing worked. Amara always came out on top, her smirk wider each time. She believed she was untouchable. But I had something she didn't know about. A past that taught me a lesson she'd never understand. Every fortress has a weakness. You see, before I was a rancher, before I was that stubborn homeowner in Amara's HOA kingdom, I was a soldier. Not the desk kind, not the paperwork kind, the boots in the mud grease on your hands kind. My specialty, armored vehicles. I trained on everything from Humvees to tanks. I knew what 60 tons of steel could do to a barricade, or in this case, to a Porsche. The memory came rushing back that night. I closed my eyes and saw myself 20 years younger, sweat dripping down my forehead as I gripped the controls of an M1 Abrams. The roar of the engine, the vibration of the treads, the smell of diesel and dust, it all came alive again. I remembered the way that machine made me feel unstoppable. That's when the idea struck me. It started as a wild thought, the kind of fantasy you laugh off in the moment. What if I just rolled a tank over her Porsche? I chuckled bitterly, sipping my whiskey. But the longer I sat there, the less it felt like a joke. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Amara's power wasn't in her words, or even the HOA bylaws. It was in that Porsche. That shiny, flawless piece of machinery was her symbol. It was the crown she wore, the shield she hid behind. Destroy the Porsche, and you destroy the myth of Amara Wallace. Of course, I didn't have a tank lying around in the barn, but I had something almost as good: friends. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through old contacts, names I hadn't dialed in years. Then I found it: Ethan Price, my old unit buddy. These days he ran operations at a military museum 2 counties over. They specialized in restoring historic vehicles, even parading them at county fairs. I hadn't spoken to him in a long time, but I knew one thing: if anyone could get me access to a tank, it was Ethan. I hesitated before calling. This was insane, even by my standards, but insanity was all I had left. So I hit dial. The phone rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Jaden Cross. Haven't heard that name in a decade. Ethan, I said, a smile tugging at my lips. Still keeping those machines alive. You know it, he replied. We've got half a dozen beauties running. Even an old Abrams. Why, you, thinking of enlisting again, I chuckled. Not exactly. I've got a problem. A Porsche-sized problem. There was a pause. Jaden, what the hell are you talking about? I told him. I told him about Amara Wallace, about the blocked gate, about the HOA meetings, about the smirk that haunted me. And when I finally said the words, I want to crush her Porsche with a tank, there was silence. Then Ethan laughed. A booming, belly-deep laugh that shook through the phone. You're serious, aren't you? Dead serious. He whistled. Well, I can't loan you a tank for target practice. But we've got a parade demo scheduled next month. We were planning to haul the Abrams out anyway. Maybe, just maybe, we could make a detour. Call it a favor between old friends. I leaned back in my chair, grinning for the first time in weeks. Ethan, you're a lifesaver. Correction, he said. I'm an accomplice. But I like where this is going. We made a plan. Nothing official, nothing in writing. Just an understanding between 2 old soldiers who knew the power of steel. For the first time since this war with Amara began, I felt hope. Not the fragile kind that comes with paperwork or petitions. Real hope, the kind that roared with diesel, weighed 60 tons, and could flatten arrogance like a soda can. But with hope came risk. If I went through with this, there'd be no turning back. The HOA would lose its mind. Amara would come after me with everything she had, lawyers, fines, maybe even the police. And yet the thought of that Porsche mangled and broken under tank treads was too sweet to ignore. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding with anticipation. The plan was reckless. It was outrageous. It was everything Amara Wallace would never see coming. And for the first time in weeks, I slept like a man who finally had the upper hand. When Ethan said he could maybe arrange something, I didn't sleep much that week. I kept picturing the Abrams rolling up the lane, the way the earth would tremble, how the neighbors would spill out of their houses like ants drawn by the sound of a picnic tin. It felt ridiculous and poetic at the same time, a 60-ton reminder that power has a weight you can actually see. The morning it arrived, the sky was faultlessly blue, the kind of clear you only get in late spring before the heat waves settle in. I heard it first, long before I saw it, the low bass rumble like a distant herd. Then a deeper vibration moved through the ground and into my boots, the kind that makes your fillings hum. I walked out onto the porch and watched as the tank rounded the bend like some prehistoric machine resurrected for a single absurd purpose. Ethan was behind the wheel, a grin splitting his weathered face. He dressed like a man who didn't care if people stared, cargo pants, a faded unit patch on his shoulder, and sunglasses that looked like they'd been shot out of a movie set. The Abrams itself looked wrong out here beside mailboxes and mail-order lawn statues, its paint dulled in places by restoration work, stenciled numbers on the turret, a string of dented, dignified history in the metal. Neighbors were already on their porches. Mrs. Alvarez waved like she was at a parade. The Johnson kids sprinted down the sidewalk, breathless with excitement. A few of Amara's allies craned their necks from behind curtains, the same curtains that had always stayed closed when things got awkward. Phones came out, cameras angled, and within minutes, half the neighborhood had a live feed. Ethan killed the engine, and the silence that followed felt heavy like the calm before a storm. We climbed down from the tank, and the smell of diesel hit me oily and honest, the scent of old battles and old friendships. I felt something strange then, part nervousness, part exhilaration, like standing at the top of a diving board you'd built yourself. We bumped along the gravel, the tank moving like a deliberate animal. I could see Amara across the street on her immaculate porch, clipboard in hand, as if she'd been expecting a community safety inspection. Her face shifted when she saw us, surprise, then a flash of irritation, then that practiced smile she wore for the HOA cameras. She didn't step back. Of course she didn't. Amara never flinched. For show, because theater matters, I had Ethan roll the tank slowly to a stop a little short of the gate, not directly on my property yet. I wanted the moment to stretch, to give everyone a chance to decide where they stood. The tank's shadow cut across the gravel like a sundial, measuring a new time for the street. A few of my friends I'd called in earlier, men who owed me favors and were happy to return them, stood at the edge of the yard trying not to laugh. Some of the older neighbors, the ones who remembered when the subdivision was a dirt road and a promise, watched with something close to relief on their faces. They'd seen men like Amara before, quick to seize authority, slow to earn respect. This was catharsis in metal form. Amara's HOA cronies fumbled out of their houses, faces drained of color. One of her board members, Ted, the same man who'd nodded along to her interpretations, stared like someone who'd been performing a dream and woke to a nightmare. Phones started recording, voices rose, and someone muttered, "Is this legal?" Ethan hopped down from the Abrams and called across the lawn. "We're here for a private demonstration, no harm intended," his voice carried. People nodded, though I could tell the phrase didn't soothe everyone. Amara, however, took it as a provocation. She marched down her steps and straight onto the sidewalk. Up close, she looked smaller than she did from across the street, skin flawless, makeup perfect, but her posture screamed command. She planted her hands on her hips and raised her chin the way a queen does when she wants court. "Jaden Cross," she said, voice loud enough for the cameras, "this is harassment. You can't bring a military vehicle onto a residential street." I felt calm, almost unnervingly so. I'd practiced this part in my head, what to say, how to keep my voice level. "It's on my property for a historical demo," I said. "Ethan's museum asked us to host a short display. You saw the paperwork." Amara's nostrils flared. "You're lying. This is intimidation." She looked at the neighbors, searching for support. Some shifted, others avoided her eyes. That was the moment I wanted the air charged with choices. She took a step toward the Porsche, as though proximity could reclaim the symbol for her. The car was parked where it always was, a deliberate shining insult. For dramatic effect, Amara opened the driver's door and leaned out, palms on the wheel, as if daring the tank to notice. Her perfume wafted across the lawn, synthetic and sweet, not unlike a courtroom's antiseptic. Phones recorded. A neighbor called the non-emergency police line. I could hear the operator ask for details in a bored voice that made my stomach tighten. But even as officers were summoned, a shift happened among the crowd. People were laughing now, incredulous, unable to believe the scene had escalated to this level. Some clapped, a few cheered, others whispered, "Finally." Ethan climbed up into the driver's hatch and spoke into his radio, making routine checks, while kids crowded behind the barricade line we'd set up to keep folks a safe distance. The tank's engine ticked like a sleeping animal, pistons settling. We positioned the Abrams so it would have a straight, unnerving line toward the Porsche. Ethan and I exchanged a look the kind soldiers share when they're about to do something irreversible. It wasn't cruelty in my eyes. It was a message, a correction, a statement that power built on bullying isn't permanent. The moment we all waited for, the moment that would decide whether this was a stunt or a turning point hung like a held breath. Amara stood with her arms folded, eyes blazing, as if daring us to act right there on the street with children watching and phones streaming. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs loud enough to drown out the murmurs. This was it, the brink. The page where the story either tilted toward spectacle or collapse. Ethan tapped his helmet a signal. He looked at me and gave the smallest of nods, businesslike old soldier gravity in his expression. The tank shifted, the treads grinding, and the gravel beneath it bowed under the weight. For a half second, every head in the neighborhood turned with me toward the Porsche. Every eye waited for the same impossible question: would I obey Amara's smirk, or do something that would change this block forever? The answer rolled forward with the next heartbeat. The air on our street had never been heavier. You could almost taste the tension like static before a lightning strike. The tank sat idling its engine, grumbling like an impatient beast. Gravel vibrated under its treads, and every window on the block had a face pressed against the glass. Phones were up. Red dots blinked as cameras recorded. The HOA drama had officially turned into a neighborhood spectacle, and at the center of it all was Amara Wallace. She stood in front of her Porsche, with her arms crossed, blazer-crisp pearls shining in the sunlight. Her expression was a cocktail of fury and disbelief, like a queen who had just discovered her throne wasn't as untouchable as she thought. "You wouldn't dare, Jaden. Cross," she shouted, her voice carrying over the low growl of the Abrams. I stepped down from the porch and into the center of the street. Every eye followed me. My boots crunched on the gravel as I stopped just a few feet from the Porsche. I looked Amara dead in the eye and said, calm as a man ordering coffee, "Move it, Amara. Last chance." Her lips curled into a smirk. "You're bluffing. This is all theater. You wouldn't dare damage private property in front of witnesses." She gestured at the crowd, her voice dripping with arrogance. "This is going live, Jaden. Everyone will see what kind of man you really are." I shrugged. "Good. Let them." The neighbors murmured the way an audience does when the hero finally draws his sword. Kids tugged at their parents' sleeves, whispering, "Is he really gonna do it?" Amara lifted her chin, defiantly climbing into the Porsche and slamming the door shut. Through the tinted glass, I could see her gripping the steering wheel, daring me to take one more step. Her engine roared to life, headlights flicking on, but she didn't move. She wasn't going to budge. Not an inch. Ethan's voice crackled in my ear from the tank hatch. Orders. I didn't look back. My eyes stayed on Amara, still smirking behind her expensive windshield. I raised one hand and pointed at the car. Forward. The Abrams roared. Exhaust belched into the air. The treads clanked slowly, grinding forward. The crowd gasped as the massive steel beast inched closer. Amara threw open her window, her voice high-pitched, now losing some of that icy control. "Stop, you'll be in prison for this." I shouted back, voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos. "You parked on private property. You've been warned. Move it now or it moves under me." For the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Her smirk faltered. She shouted something to the board members standing nearby. Tell him this is illegal," but they didn't move. Ted, her most loyal puppet, suddenly found the ground very interesting. "Mrs." Alvarez actually smiled faintly. A few neighbors even clapped nervously like they were watching a live-action play and couldn't believe they had front-row seats. Amara realized she was alone. For the first time in her reign as HOA president, no one was rushing to her defense. No one was echoing her lines. No one was propping up her authority. And I knew then I had already won. Still, I wasn't about to let her off easy. I walked closer, stopping just a few feet from the Porsche's bumper. I leaned down, resting my hands on my knees, and spoke loud enough for her and the cameras to hear. "You've got 10 seconds. After that, your Porsche becomes a hood ornament." Her jaw dropped. "You wouldn't," I cut her off. 10. The Abrams crept forward another inch, the sound of steel on gravel like a countdown drumbeat. 9. Neighbors counted with me under their breath. Phones zoomed in on Amara's face, catching every twitch. 8. Sweat glistened on her forehead. She gripped the wheel tighter, but her bravado was cracking. 7. The tank's shadow stretched across the Porsche, swallowing it whole. 6. Amara slammed her palm against the horn, its shrill blare echoing through the cul-de-sac. 5. Ethan revved the engine for effect. The ground trembled. 4. Her eyes darted left and right. Still, no one stepped forward to save her. 3. Her smirk was gone now, replaced by panic. 2. Her lips moved, forming a silent curse. 1. I straightened up and nodded. Roll. The tank lurched forward, treads grinding. The front of the Abrams closed the gap with terrifying inevitability. The crowd erupted into shouts, half in panic, half in exhilaration. Amara screamed, fumbling with the ignition. At the very last possible second, the Porsche roared to life and shot backward, tires squealing. She jerked the wheel, swerving it into her own driveway so violently the bumper scraped the curb. The Abrams stopped where the Porsche had been its nose, just inches from the empty space. Smoke curled into the air, and silence fell over the crowd. I turned to Amara, who sat pale and trembling behind her wheel. Her pearls glistened under the sweat beating down her neck. "You were warned," I said, simply, then turned my back and walked toward the porch. The neighbors erupted, cheers, applause, even laughter. Mrs. Alvarez hollered bout time. Somebody stood up to her. Ethan cut the engine, and the silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on Amara. Her Porsche was safe for now, but the myth of her untouchable power had just been crushed, without a single tread touching her car. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The Porsche would be back. And when it did, so would the tank. The thing about people like Amara Wallace is they don't know when to quit. Most folks would have taken that near miss, having 60 tons of steel stop inches from their beloved Porsche, as a wake-up call. A chance to reassess, maybe even to apologize. But Amara wasn't most folks. 2 mornings later, I walked out with my coffee, and there it was again, her silver Porsche 911 parked right across my gate like nothing had happened. Like the tank was just a bad dream, and she was still queen of the cul-de-sac. Except this time there was no smirk when she saw me, no smug wave. She sat inside her car, sunglasses on, phone pressed to her ear, pretending I didn't exist, pretending the world still revolved around her rules. I set my mug down on the porch railing and sighed. She wanted a war. Fine. Ethan was already waiting in the tank engine, idling low. He raised a brow through the hatch. I gave a simple nod. "Showtime," I said. The Abrams roared to life exhaust, blasting like dragon's breath. The ground shook. Neighbors poured out of their houses again like they'd been waiting for the encore performance. Phones angled. Live streams clicked on. Even kids sat cross-legged on lawns, whispering like they were about to witness history. This time there was no countdown, no second chances. Ethan eased the tank forward, treads clanking like iron footsteps of justice. The shadow swallowed the Porsche whole, and the air filled with a rising hum of disbelief. Amara's sunglasses hid her eyes, but her stiff posture betrayed her nerves. She revved the Porsche's engine in protest, but she didn't move. Maybe she thought the HOA bylaws would protect her. Maybe she thought I'd back down in front of cameras. Or maybe her pride simply outweighed her common sense. The Abrams crept closer. 10 feet. 5. 3. The Porsche's horn blared, a panicked shriek that bounced off every wall in the neighborhood. Then the first contact. A metallic screech cut through the air as the Abrams front plate pressed into the Porsche's rear bumper. The crowd gasped in unison. For a split second, it was as if time froze. And then crunch. The Porsche buckled like a soda can. Metal screamed glass, exploded, and the air filled with the unmistakable sound of wealth meeting physics. The hood folded inward, headlights shattered, alarms wailed in a desperate chorus. The Porsche, once a polished monument to arrogance, now looked like a crumpled toy left in the sun too long. Amara screamed, scrambling out of the driver's side, just as the tank rolled further, grinding the once pristine sports car under its treads. Her heels clattered on the pavement as she stumbled away, hands clutching her pearls like they might save her. Neighbors erupted. Some cheered, some howled in disbelief, others simply clapped like they'd been waiting for this day their whole lives. A teenager yelled, "Flatten it," and the crowd roared in approval. The Porsche's windows burst one after another, a chain of tiny explosions under the crushing weight. The tank's tracks chewed through leather seats, polished metal, expensive electronics, every piece of vanity Amara had polished and flaunted. With each groan of destruction, her power crumbled with it. When the Abrams finally rolled off, what remained of the Porsche was barely recognizable. The once shiny symbol of prestige was now a twisted, flattened carcass hood, folded roof, pancaked glass scattered across the street like glitter. Smoke hissed from the wreckage, mingling with the acrid smell of oil and rubber. I stepped forward, hands on my hips, and looked at the ruin. Guess it wasn't HOA-approved parking after all. The crowd laughed loud, unrestrained, almost cathartic. Even the board members who usually bowed to Amara's authority stood frozen, unable to defend her anymore. Amara, however, wasn't laughing. Her face was red, streaked with tears of rage. She screamed at the top of her lungs. "Vandalism, trespass, this is a crime." Her voice cracked desperation, bleeding through every syllable. I turned to her, calm as ever, and held up my deed papers. "Actually, Amara, it's called removing trespassers. And now so is your car. The police arrived not long after sirens wailing. Officers climbed out of their cars, blinking at the surreal sight of a tank parked casually on a suburban street and the flattened luxury sports car beneath it. One officer muttered Jesus Christ under his breath. Amara rushed toward them wailing, "Arrest him, he destroyed my Porsche." The officers inspected the scene, then my paperwork. They saw the recordings. Multiple neighbors had streamed the entire showdown live, catching every detail, every warning, every refusal from Amara to move. Finally, Officer Daniels, the same man who'd shrugged weeks earlier, turned to Amara and said, "Ma'am, your vehicle was illegally blocking private access. The evidence is pretty clear." Amara's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious," Daniels sighed. "You can file a civil complaint if you want, but from what I see here, he warned you. You ignored him. That's on you." The crowd erupted again, some laughing, some applauding. Amara's empire had just collapsed in front of everyone, broadcast live for the whole world to see. And me, I just stood there calm and collected, sipping the coffee I'd left on the porch. Because finally, after weeks of humiliation, wasted hours, and 1,000 smug smirks, justice had rolled in on steel tracks. The smoke still hung in the air when the last echoes of destruction faded. The tank's treads had left deep grooves in the asphalt, and Amara's once pristine Porsche now looked like a sculpture someone had forgotten to finish, a slab of twisted steel, shattered glass, and crushed leather. Neighbors circled at a safe distance, phones still held high, their voices buzzing like bees around honey. For years, Amara Wallace had controlled this neighborhood with a polished smile and an iron clipboard. But now she was pacing in her driveway like a caged animal, shrieking at anyone who dared meet her eyes. "This isn't over," she screamed, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "You'll pay for this, Jaden. You'll pay dearly." The problem for her was that nobody was nodding along this time. Nobody echoed her outrage. Not Ted, not the board members, not even the nervous neighbor who always parroted her lines at meetings. They just stood there silent, watching their queen unravel. Mrs. Alvarez was the first to speak, voice sharp as a whip. "Amara, you've been blocking his gate for weeks. We all saw it. You brought this on yourself." A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. Heads nodded. People whispered not against me, but against her. The tide had turned, and Amara looked around in disbelief, realizing her loyal subjects had quietly defected. The police officers, still surveying the scene, tried to maintain their composure, but even they looked stunned. One officer knelt by the flattened Porsche, shaking his head. "You'll need a tow, ma'am. That's totaled." Amara's face flushed crimson. Totaled. This was a $150,000 car. He destroyed my property. I stepped forward, holding my deed in one hand and my phone in the other. "And here's the footage of you trespassing on private property, Amara." For weeks, refusing to move when asked, refusing even when warned, I gestured to the neighbors still live streaming. And it's not just my word anymore. Half the neighborhood has the receipts. One officer sighed, flipping through the paperwork. "Ma'am, as I said before, you can file a civil claim, but based on what I see here, Mr. Cross acted on property clearly documented as his access. You ignored repeated warnings. There's nothing criminal here." The words hit her harder than the tank ever could. Amara staggered back against her porch, railing her eyes, darting wildly for some kind of escape route, some ally to throw her a lifeline. None came. Even her board members looked away, embarrassed, unwilling to go down with her sinking ship. Neighbors began to laugh, not cruelly, but with the relief of people who had lived too long under the weight of one person's control. Someone shouted, "About time," and the crowd broke into scattered applause. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste, and looked at the twisted wreck in front of my gate. "Guess your parking privileges expired," I said dryly. That line sealed it. The crowd erupted into full-on laughter. Phones caught every word, and within minutes I knew clips of Amara's downfall would be circulating online. HOA President's Porsche, crushed by tank, was about as viral a headline as you could get. Later that evening, after the police had left and the tow truck hauled away what was left of the Porsche, I sat on my porch and watched the sunset. For the first time in weeks, my gate stood open and clear. My driveway was mine again. Peace settled over me like a long-lost friend. But Amara, she wasn't done thrashing. I saw her lights flicker on and off that night, heard muffled shouts through her open windows. At one point, she stormed out onto her lawn with her phone, yelling into it about lawyers, lawsuits, connections who would ruin me. The truth was, her power was gone. The moment the Porsche crumpled, so did the illusion of her invincibility. The HOA board was already murmuring about new elections. Neighbors who once feared her wrath were suddenly emboldened, swapping stories about her petty fines, her threats, her intimidation tactics. By the end of the week, it was official. Amara was removed as HOA president in an emergency vote. Ted resigned out of stress. The rest of the board distanced themselves, claiming they never agreed with her methods. Cowards, all of them, but useful in sealing her downfall. As for Amara herself, she sulked in her house like a dethroned monarch. The Porsche had been her symbol of authority, and without it she looked strangely smaller, diminished. Her driveway was empty now, a void where her arrogance once sat polished and gleaming. One evening I caught sight of her across the street, staring daggers at me from her porch. She shouted something, probably another threat, but the sound of laughter from neighbors drowned her out. For once her words carried no weight. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't need to fight her in court, didn't need to beg the police, didn't need to endure endless HOA meetings. All it took was a tank and a single decisive moment to shift the entire balance of power. Of course I knew she'd keep trying. People like Amara don't just vanish quietly. They flail, they plot, they threaten, but the damage was done. Her Porsche was scrap metal, her reputation was rubble, and her empire of fear had collapsed in plain sight. And me, I finally had my driveway back. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the crickets chirp in the evening air, and thought about how fragile power really island. Sometimes it takes years of scheming to build it up. Sometimes it takes one steel tread to knock it all down. For a week after the Great Tank incident, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter, the sidewalks friendlier, the whispers bolder. People smiled more, waved more, even lingered on their lawns to chat in ways they hadn't before. It was as if crushing that Porsche had broken not just steel and leather, but the invisible grip Amara Wallace held over everyone. Her downfall was swift. Within days, the HOA board called an emergency vote. The outcome was inevitable. Even her staunchest allies turned on her, muttering about liability and bad optics. Amara had ruled them with fear, and now that fear had collapsed, replaced with embarrassment. By Friday evening, she was out as president. I watched from my porch as she stormed out of the meeting, clutching a stack of folders and waving her pearls like a battle flag. "This community will regret this," she shouted, but her words carried no weight. The neighbors only shook their heads, some smirking openly. Her reign was over, and everyone knew it. The Porsche, or what was left of it, was gone by then, hauled away on a flatbed that creaked under the twisted wreckage. The sight of it driving off had felt symbolic, like a funeral procession for arrogance. In its place, Amara's driveway was bare, an empty scar of asphalt where her pride once gleamed. And yet she still lingered. For a few days she paced her yard with a phone glued to her ear, spitting venom about lawyers and lawsuits. She sent me a letter, typed formal, full of accusations. Restitution was her favorite word. I pinned it to my fridge with a magnet shaped like a cow and laughed every time I grabbed a beer. But lawsuits need money, and Amara's wealth had always been tied up in appearances. The Porsche wasn't just her car, it was her calling card, her weapon, her proof of superiority. Without it, she was just another homeowner, and one with very few friends left. By the end of the month, a for sale sign sprouted in her perfect front lawn. Luxury home HOA, community perks. The irony made me laugh so hard I nearly spit out my coffee. When the moving trucks came, the neighborhood watched from their porches like spectators at a parade. Amara barked at the movers, cursed at her own boxes, slammed car doors. But nobody lifted a finger to help. Even Ted once, her lapdog, didn't so much as wave. She climbed into a rented sedan, humiliating in itself for someone who used to flaunt a six-figure Porsche, and peeled out of the cul-de-sac without a backward glance. Just like that, the queen was gone. Peace settled in like a long summer evening. For the first time in months, my gate stood clear and unobstructed. Deliveries rolled through without delay. Friends visited without fear of parking tickets. The neighbors, emboldened by Amara's absence, started talking about dismantling some of the stricter HOA rules. It felt like a small town again, not a dictatorship with manicured hedges. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields, Gold Ethan sat with me on the porch, both of us nursing beers. The tank still parked by the barn loomed like a silent sentinel. "You know," Ethan said, tipping his bottle toward it, "we were supposed to haul that thing back last week." I chuckled. "I figured the museum would want it returned in one piece." He grinned. "Oh, they do, but I told them it's on extended demo duty." They didn't argue. He paused, eyes glinting with mischief. "Unless, of course, you want to keep it a little longer. Could be useful. HOA disputes, break-ins, trespassers, doorstop." I nearly choked on my beer. "You're offering me a tank as a doorstop. Better than a Porsche blocking your gate," he said. We both laughed the kind of laugh only old soldiers share, the kind that comes from knowing you've walked through fire and come out the other side with stories no one else would believe. I leaned back, watching the tank's silhouette against the fading light. You know, Ethan, I think I'll hang on to it for now. You never know when another HOA war might be brewing. The words hung in the air, half joke, half truth. Because in neighborhoods like ours, peace was never permanent. There was always another Amara waiting in the wings, clipboard in hand, ready to test the limits of patience and property lines. But this time, I wasn't worried. I had my gate, my deed, my neighbor's respect, and 60 tons of backup parked by the barn. For once, the balance of power was exactly where it belonged. Looking back, it's almost funny how something as simple as a car could hold an entire neighborhood hostage. But the truth is, it was never just about the Porsche. It was about arrogance, power, and the way one person can use rules like weapons instead of tools for community. Amara Wallace believed she was untouchable, that her position as HOA president made her stronger than everyone else combined. What she forgot was the simplest truth: power, built on fear, is fragile, and it crumbles the moment someone stands up. I didn't set out to start a war with a tank. I only wanted peace, my gate clear, my home respected, my rights recognized. But when all the polite paths failed, when every phone call and petition and meeting was ignored, I had to choose, surrender or fight. And sometimes fighting means reminding a bully that their fortress isn't as strong as they think. What I learned is this: you don't need 60 tons of steel to change your life, but you do need courage. Courage to say no. Courage to stand your ground. Courage to laugh in the face of arrogance and keep pushing until you win. So to everyone watching, have you ever faced your own HOA Karen? Have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought they were above the rules? Drop your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to subscribe, because in this neighborhood the drama never really ends.